I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's about as gentle as I can put it now, that enough time has passed for me to see the shape of it. I was 40, running a diesel bay 6 days a week, coming home with cold hands and metal dust in the lines of my skin, and trying to hold together an old riverside place my father left me when he died. My wife, Lena, had been gone 11 months. A drunk driver on a wet county road had turned one ordinary Tuesday into a permanent dividing line. I had debts I could count and grief I couldn't, and a 9-year-old son, Micah, who hadn't spoken a word in 3 years, not even before we lost her. After she died, the quiet in our house got so thick it had weight. I called it the silence between them in my head first. Then, after a while, the silence between us, because honesty has a way of walking right up to you when you're too tired to dodge it. The place sat above Alder Creek on the lower shoulder of the Cascades, where fir and cedar crowded close, and the river fog liked to settle in the low spots past sunrise. It wasn't picturesque the way city folks mean when they say that word. It was practical land. Hard ground in summer, slick clay in rain, brush that came back meaner every spring if you didn't keep after it. The house itself leaned in 2 places and complained in high wind, but the roof held, and the well pump still pulled clear water if you were patient with the switch. I knew how to work on a Cummins injector and how to straighten a bent gate hinge with a chain and a jack handle. I did not know how to reach my own boy when he drifted into those long, inward places where no voice could follow. Micah was thin and wiry, all elbows and watchfulness, with Lena's dark eyes, and my tendency to line things up. He arranged toys as a toddler, lined up spoons when he was 5, and by 9 he arranged stones by size and colour, like he was balancing a world that only made sense if each piece sat where it belonged. Every afternoon, unless the rain came sideways, he walked down the worn path to the creek bend and sat on the flat shale shelf near the alder roots. He would stay there for hours, selecting stones, rinsing them, setting them in careful rows that curved with the waterline. He hummed sometimes, low in his throat, the kind of sound you felt more than heard. I'd work within sightline, splitting rounds, patching fence, clearing windfall, pretending I wasn't counting how many times he looked back toward me. Most days it was once, some days not at all. People who haven't lived it think silence means calm. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it's just distance that learned to sit still. I wanted to be the father who did this right, the one with endless patience and a soft voice and a pocket full of strategies from therapists and books. Instead, I was often a man with a bad back and a short fuse I kept swallowing before it got near him. I made laminated cards with pictures for requests. I taped schedules on the fridge. I learned to wait an extra 10 seconds before repeating a question. I went to workshops in church basements where kind women explained sensory regulation while my phone buzzed with shop emergencies. I did the work. That was never the problem. The problem was I kept measuring progress like a repair timeline, and grief does not respect timelines. Not mine, not his. By the second week of September, the maples along the drive had started rusting at the edges, and the mornings came with that iron-cold smell that says, winter is thinking about you. I woke at 4:30 most days, fed Boone, brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, packed Micah's lunch if it was a school day, and headed to Jennings Diesel and Ag before dawn. Boone was our old red-tick hound, 12 years if he was a day, half blind in one eye, hips stiff in the cold, loyal in the way old dogs are loyal when they've seen every version of your worst mood and keep showing up anyway. At 5:30 sharp, he'd nose Micah's knee, while I tied work boots, and Micah would lay a hand on his head without looking up. That touch was one of the few constants left. At the shop, men talked around me like I was normal, which I appreciated more than I said. Marty ran parts and drank too much Diet Cola. Eli handled tires and told bad jokes as a public service. They gave me room on the days I needed quiet and gave me grief on the days I looked too far gone. And that balance probably kept me from folding up. I turned wrenches, chased electrical faults, rebuilt what could be rebuilt, and told customers the truth when something wasn't worth saving. Engines were fair. If fuel and air and timing were right, they ran. If one thing was off, you could test and isolate until you found it. Home wasn't fair. Home was me setting 2 plates out by habit and putting one back in the cabinet before Micah came to the table. I picked Micah up from school at 3:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays for speech therapy in town. His therapist, Nora Bell, wore soft sweaters and practical shoes and never made me feel dumb for asking the same question in a different way every month. One Thursday, she met me in the hallway with her clipboard tucked to her chest and said, "He tracked your face more today. That's meaningful, Dean. It may not feel dramatic, but it matters." I nodded and looked past her at the mural of forest animals peeling off the cinder block wall. I need to do better at home. I know that. You need to do sustainable, she said. Not heroic for 1 week, then burned out for 3. Sit with him where he regulates best, match his pace, let connection be small, and repeated. He sits at that creek till dark. Then that's where you start. I drove home with that sentence rattling around in me like a loose bolt in a drive shaft. Sustainable, not heroic. It sounded wise and impossible at the same time. That evening, while Micah lined up clean stones in a row by the porch step, I stood at the sink and watched his reflection in the window over my own shoulder. I remember thinking in present tense because grief had me trapped there. I am standing 3 feet away from my son, and I do not know how to cross it. I am good at torque specs and gasket seals and rationing groceries till payday. I am not good at this narrow bridge between his world and mine. I told myself to breathe slower, to lower my shoulders, to stop making every silence into a verdict. I told myself this couldn't be measured by words spoken or eye contact earned, not tonight, not like this. He set one stone, then another, then stopped and pressed his palm flat against the wood beside him, leaving room. I stood there a full 5 seconds before I sat down. We sat on that porch with Boone stretched at our boots and the creek moving through dusk below us. No music, no television, just moths around the porch light and the occasional truck far off on County Road 12. Micah nudged a striped stone toward me. I placed it beside the others, too close. He moved it 1/2 inch left. I adjusted. He set a darker one at the end and tapped twice. I matched his rhythm on the railing. Tap, tap. He didn't look at me, but his breathing eased and mine followed. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. Money pressed in from every side that year. Property tax was overdue. The transmission on my service truck slipped in second. I sold Lena's kayak in October and sat in the driveway afterward with my hands on the steering wheel until Boone whined from the passenger seat. I hated selling it, hated needing to. But groceries and heating oil are not paid with sentiment, and I'd learned to choose what kept us warm. On nights when worry got loud, I walked the fence line with a headlamp and checked latches that hadn't needed checking. Work I could complete settled me. Work with an end point made sense. By late October, rain came in long grey sheets that polished the trunks dark and turned the path to Alder Creek into slick ribbons between roots. Micah still went down there most afternoons, hood up, boots muddy to the ankles, carrying his little canvas pouch of good stones, like a man headed to an office. I trailed behind with an armload of split alder for the rack near the bank, set it down, and kept to my tasks where he could see me if he lifted his head. Sometimes I mended a fishnet I hadn't used in 2 seasons, just to have my hands occupied. Sometimes I sat on the overturned bucket Nora had told me to keep there and watched him work in that patient, exact way that felt both heartbreaking and holy. One Saturday, rain took a break around noon and left the whole place rinsed clean, cedar scent sharp in the air, clouds snagged low on the ridge. My brother Cal drove up in his dented Tacoma with a load of fence posts and 2 sacks of feed. He had his own farm 15 miles east, and the manner of a man who solved things by lifting them. He set the sacks by the shed and glanced toward the creek where Micah sat in his orange rain jacket, arranging stones under a cottonwood that had dropped half its leaves overnight. "How's he doing?" "Depends on the hour," I said. Cal wiped his hands on his jeans. "And you?" "Also depends on the hour." He gave me that sideways family look that says I love you enough not to push too hard. "You eating regular?" "Mostly." "That means no. I brought chili. Freeze what you won't use." I leaned on the fence post between us. "Appreciate it." He watched Micah a moment longer. "He likes that creek." "Yeah." "Then let him like it. You don't have to force a map over every mile." I laughed once, dry as a spark. "You been reading parenting books now?" "Just made enough mistakes to recognize a few," he said, and clapped my shoulder before heading back to the truck. After he left, I carried the posts to the lower pasture and drove in 3 of them before the light started thinning. Micah remained by the water, steady as a marker stone. Boone curled nearby with one ear turned toward him. I remember standing there with a post maul in my hand, rain starting up again, and seeing the shape of our life more clearly than I had in months. It wasn't the life we planned. It wasn't the man I used to be. But it was ours, and it was still standing. I walked down to the creek, set the maul aside, and took the bucket seat 10 steps closer than I had the day before. Micah slid a flat grey stone into the nearest row, then reached into his pouch and placed one in my open palm without looking up. I held it while the rain ticked on the creek, and Boone sighed himself to sleep. And for the first time since Lena died, the silence between us felt less like a wall and more like a trail I might actually learn to walk. The rain kept at it another 10 minutes, then softened to a fine mist that hung between the alders like breath. Micah kept arranging stones, deliberate and unbothered, while I sat with that flat grey one warming in my palm, learning the shape of doing nothing on purpose. Boone lifted his head once when a branch shed water, decided it wasn't worth the effort, and folded back down with a grunt that sounded old and satisfied. When the light thinned to that pewter colour right before dark, Micah put the last stone in place, tapped the edge of the row twice, and stood. I stood with him. We walked the path back up to the house without talking, his shoulder brushing my elbow twice on the narrow turn by the cedar stump. It felt like a small mercy, and small mercies were what we had. Inside, I heated Cal's chili, and we ate at the kitchen table with the yellow lamp that made everything look softer than it was. Micah lined his spoon and cup parallel to the table grain, then nudged his cup a finger width closer to mine. I noticed and pretended not to notice because sometimes attention made him pull back. After dishes, he sat on the rug with Boone's ear in one hand and a smooth white pebble in the other until his eyes went heavy. I got him to bed by 8:30. He rolled toward the wall, clutching that pebble, and I stood in the doorway longer than I needed to, listening to the old house settle around us. I should have gone to sleep. Instead, I pulled on my canvas jacket, stepped out onto the porch, and let the cold wake me up in all the wrong places. The creek was louder at night, fuller from the rain, a constant moving sound that made the yard feel farther from the road than it really was. I could smell wet cedar, split alder, and the faint metallic tang that rides up from riverstones after a storm. My body ached in practical ways. Lower back, right wrist, the knot between my shoulder blades from too many years leaning over engine bays. But the ache that stayed with me was the one I couldn't point to. Grief never sat still. It moved from room to room and waited where you'd least like company. I leaned on the porch rail and watched the dark line where the yard dropped toward Alder Creek. There's a kind of despair that isn't dramatic at all. It's just a man staring at a patch of night, doing arithmetic with grocery money in his head while wondering whether his son feels loved in the exact way he needs to feel it. I remember slipping into present tense again, the way I did when I was worn down to the studs. I am standing in my own yard and I still feel like a visitor. I am trying every method they hand me and I still lose patience over boots in the hallway. I can replace a water pump in under an hour. I cannot make my boy's world less hard. I told myself this was what Nora meant by sustainable, that you keep showing up, even when showing up feels like failure in slow motion. I told myself to stop demanding a breakthrough and start honoring a pattern. But the old fear sat right there with me anyway, quiet as frost. Maybe I had already missed whatever doorway mattered. By the first week of November, the mornings came white at the edges. Not full frost yet, just a skin of cold that silvered the grass and made the hose stiff as a stick. I settled into the rhythm Nora had given me. Not elegant, just repeatable. Work till 2 when I could swing it, pick up Micah, quick snack at home, then down to the creek with the overturned bucket and a thermos. I stopped pretending I had a dozen chores to do at once. Some days I split wood after dark by headlamp. Some days the fence stayed broken one more day. I sat where Micah could see me, kept my hands busy with old tackle line or a loose hinge, and matched his pace when he looked toward me. A row of stones, a pause, another row, a tap on shale, a breath. That Tuesday, the sky never really brightened. Clouds pressed low enough to blur the ridgeline, and the whole property held that muted waiting quiet you get before weather changes its mind. Micah took his usual place on the flat shelf by the alder roots. Boone stretched out near him for 10 minutes, then got up without hurry and walked toward the tree line above the bend. Not prowling, not stiff, just purposeful, like he'd remembered an appointment. He stopped at the edge of a patch of fir shade where sword ferns crowded thick, turned once, and sat, straight-backed, ears forward, calm as a church usher waiting for late arrivals. I watched him for a while, expecting him to nose around for rabbit scent or decide his hips hurt and come back. He didn't. He stayed fixed on that same spot between 2 fir trunks, tail laid still, breathing easy. No growl, no whining, no raised hackles. Just attention. "Boone," I called softly. "Come on, buddy." One ear twitched. He did not move. Micah glanced up from his stones and followed my line of sight. He didn't flinch, didn't crowd me, didn't signal distress. He simply looked toward the fir shade, then back to his work, humming under his breath in a thin, steady thread. That humming had been rare lately. Hearing it then, with Boone sitting like a sentry who wasn't worried about anything, made the hair rise on my forearms for reasons I couldn't name. And the woods had gone quiet. Not empty quiet, not dead. Layered quiet. The creek kept moving. Wind moved high in the firs, but the small sounds were missing. No jay complaints. No squirrel chatter in the alder branches. No little scratchings in leaves. Even the chickadees that usually worked the thickets near dusk were absent. It felt less like silence and more like a room where conversation had paused because somebody had entered. I stood, knees popping, and walked halfway up toward Boone, careful on the slick path. "You see something?" He turned his head just enough to check where I was, then faced forward again, composed and almost polite. I actually lowered my voice as if I'd stepped into someone else's campsite. "All right," I muttered, half to him and half to whatever I couldn't see. We're just passing through. That was when I caught myself and almost laughed. A 40-year-old mechanic whispering manners to a stand of furs. If Eli from the shop could have seen me, he'd have put it on a t-shirt by Friday. Still, I stayed where I was another minute, listening. No crash of brush, no heavy footfalls, no sign of a bear pushing through. Just the creak and that deliberate stillness holding steady like a hand on your shoulder. When the light finally dropped, Boone stood on his own, shook once, and trotted back to Micah, as if nothing unusual had happened. We walked home in mist that had turned almost to drizzle again. At the mudroom door, I towelled Boone off and checked his paws by habit, then looked out toward the dark yard and felt watched in the mildest way, not hunted, not cornered, just noticed. I slept badly anyway, because old habits don't surrender in one afternoon. The next day cleared bright and cold, one of those sharp November afternoons where every wet branch shines. I left work early, picked up Micah, and we went down to the creek with Boone trailing and snuffling at the edges of old scent trails. Micah reached his spot, crouched, and froze. Not panic froze, attention froze. He tilted his head and made that tiny clicking sound he used when he found something interesting. I stepped in beside him and saw it laid out on the shale shelf where his rows usually began. 3 smooth black river stones, each about the size of a hen's egg, arranged in a cross pattern. A pale feather, dull grey with a white tip, rested diagonally across them. Beside the stones sat a small spray of yarrow, stems trimmed clean, blossoms still fresh. No mud smeared over it, no crushed petals, no random scatter. Placed. Deliberately. I looked at Micah. "Did you bring these from your pouch?" He held the pouch open for me, empty except for 2 striped pebbles and a bit of twine he liked to carry. Then he shook his head once. I looked around the bank. We didn't have yarrow growing this close to the water this time of year. The nearest patch was up by the old fence line, 50 yards away and mostly gone to frost. The black stones were creek stones, sure, but not from this immediate shelf. This section usually gave us brown shale and granite fleck, not this smooth, dark basalt. I crouched and held my hand near the arrangement, without touching it. Boone came up beside me, sniffed once, then sat. His tail thumped twice against damp leaves, slow and easy. "Okay," I said quietly, mostly to keep my own thoughts from running wild. "Could be kids from upstream, could be somebody walking through early." No boot prints I could see except mine and Micah's from the previous day, softened by overnight moisture. No candy wrappers. No monofilament tangles. No signs of teenagers doing boredom art. Just that small arrangement, like a sentence, in a language I almost recognized. Micah reached out, paused over the feather, then looked at me for permission. I nodded. He lifted it carefully and set it beside his first row of stones like it belonged there. Then he picked up one of the black stones, turned it in his fingers, and placed it at the center of a new line. His shoulders lowered, his breathing settled. Whatever this was, it hadn't unsettled him. It had invited him. I sat on the bucket and watched him build around those pieces, my skepticism hardening out of self-defense because I did not have room in my life for mysteries. Mysteries don't pay electric bills. Mysteries don't explain themselves on command. But underneath that stubborn, practical voice, another feeling kept rising, quieter and harder to dismiss. The woods didn't feel indifferent out there. They felt attentive, not in a way that demanded anything from us, in a way that made room. We stayed until the sun slid behind the ridge and the cold came down fast. Before we left, I took a clean sandwich bag from my jacket pocket, habit from years of keeping bolts and washers together. And, after a long hesitation, I bagged one fallen yarrow floret from the edge of the arrangement, where it had already dropped. Not the main spray, just one little piece for proof. I could hold later under better light, maybe to convince myself I hadn't misseen the whole thing. I tucked the bag into my inner pocket, called Boone, and helped Micah up the path. At the top, Micah stopped, turned back toward the creek, and lifted his hand chest high, palm out for 3 seconds. Not a wave exactly, more like acknowledgement. Boone stood beside him and looked the same direction, tail giving one slow sweep. I followed their gaze to the fir shade above the bend. Nothing moved there that I could see. The wind stirred fern tips, and creek mist rose in thin strands between trunks. "Come on, bud," I said, gentle and steady. "Let's get you warm." He nodded and walked with me toward the porch, feather tucked in his pocket, while dusk settled over Alder Creek and the quiet kept its own counsel behind us. At the mudroom bench, I knelt to unlace Micah's boots, and he stood patient and swaying, tired in the way kids get when the light goes out before their energy does. Boone leaned his shoulder into my thigh while I worked, wet fur smelling like creek water and leaves. I hung Micah's jacket, and the pale feather slid half out of his pocket. He pushed it back in with careful fingers, then tapped my wrist twice, the way he did when he wanted me to slow down and notice. I nodded, and he nodded back, agreement made. In the kitchen, I warmed leftover chili, set cornbread on a plate, and kept touching my inner pocket to make sure that tiny sandwich bag with the yarrow floret was still there, as if it might vanish if I looked away. After Micah went to bed, I set the bag on the table under the yellow lamp and brought over my reading glasses, the cheap magnifier I used for injector seals, and an old envelope from the power bill drawer. The floret was fresh enough that the white petals still held shape. The cut on the stem was clean, not torn. I turned it with tweezers and stared like I could wrench a confession out of a plant. Boone watched me from his blanket with one open eye, then sighed like a man disappointed in my evening choices. I wrote one line on the envelope in block letters. Alder Creek, November 6th, edge of stone arrangement. Then I slid the bag inside and put it in the top drawer beside spare fuses and a tire gauge. I stood at the sink afterward, hands braced on chipped enamel, and slipped into that present tense place I went when my mind refused to shut down. I am making evidence packets at my own kitchen table because admitting wonder feels riskier than admitting grief. I am trying to keep this practical, measurable, contained. I am afraid of false hope in any form, even a flower stem. I am also afraid that if I flatten this into logic too fast, I will miss something my son already understands. The creek gave him a thing he accepted without flinching. I saw it. Boone saw it. If I pretend none of it happened, what exactly am I protecting? Pride, probably. Control, definitely. I turned off the lamp and went to bed with no answer I trusted. The next afternoon broke clear and brittle, sunlight bright as tin on wet rock. I met Micah at school pickup, and he climbed into the truck with his canvas stone pouch in both hands, like he'd been waiting all day for one specific appointment. At home, he ate half an apple standing at the counter, then walked to the door before I'd even pulled my boots back on. We went down the path together, Boone padding ahead and stopping every few yards to sniff fern bases with old dog ceremony. At the creek shelf, Micah crouched and started sorting right away, and I took the bucket 6 steps closer than yesterday. I set my tackle box on my knee, opened it, and pretended I cared deeply about organizing hooks by size. Nothing dramatic happened in that first hour, and that was part of what kept me there. The woods sounded normal for once. Water over stone, 2 crows arguing upslope, chickadees zigzagging through alder branches like they were late for somewhere. Micah built a double row, Pale stones outside, darker ones inside, feather laid at the far end. Boone dozed with his muzzle on his paws. Every so often, Micah held up a stone, and if I gave him a thumbs up, he placed it. If I tilted my head, he rotated it and tried again. I found myself smiling at that without effort. The grief was still in me. Same weight, same edges, but curiosity had climbed into the front seat for a while and asked for the map. By Friday of that week, I had started checking that same patch of fir shade every time we came down, not with dread, just a tension sharpened by repetition. Micah's arrangements kept including pieces we hadn't brought. A strand of twined grass looped in a neat circle, 2 quartz pebbles milky white and warm from sun, though the shelf sat mostly in shadow. A strip of bark folded like a little tent and set beside his first row. None of it was random scatter. Boone's tail did that same slow thump each time something new appeared, as if he'd heard good news and didn't need to explain it. I moved my bucket closer again, maybe 20 yards from Micah now, and worked a bent swivel straight, while trying not to look like a man waiting for a curtain to move. I ran through explanations because that's what I do when parts don't match the diagram. Kids from upstream messing with us, a neighbor with too much free time and an art streak. Micah carrying objects up in that pouch when I wasn't looking. But each theory came up short on little facts that stacked into one stubborn pile. The grass loops were braided from long sedge we only had lower on the bank where footing was slick, and I'd never seen Micah climb alone. The quartz pieces were from the gravel bar across the creek, not this side. On Sunday, I found a small cluster of salmonberry canes bent away from the shale shelf, creating a cleaner path down for Micah's boots, like someone had opened a door and stepped back. No cuts, no snapped stems, just careful pressure and release. That afternoon, my brother Cal called while I was rinsing coffee mugs. "You coming by for feed next week?" "Yeah," I said. "Tuesday if the shop doesn't blow up." He heard something in my voice and paused. "You sound wired. Everything okay?" I looked out the window at Micah on the porch step, turning his black stone in sunlight. Depends how okay is defined. I keep finding little arrangements down at the creek. Things set out for him. Not trash, not footprints I can use, just intentional. Boone acts like we're meeting church elders. Cal let out a breath that could have been a laugh or concern. Could be somebody kind. Could be a neighbor kid. Maybe. Any sign it's unsafe? No. Then stay observant and don't spook yourself into a story. You're tired, Dean. I know. You need me to come sit there one afternoon? I thought about it, about another set of eyes, about turning something private into a committee. Not yet. I'll tell you if that changes. You do that, he said, and eat supper before 9. I promised, and I did. External advice received, practical, unresolved only in the way weather is unresolved. Monday brought low clouds and a wind that smelled like snow higher up, though none reached us. Micah seemed keyed in from the start, shoulders loose, humming under his breath while he worked. I caught the tune pattern and tapped it on my tackle lid, and he mirrored it on stone. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It went on long enough that I forgot to perform being composed. Then Boone rose, not stiff, just alert, and looked toward the far bank where a fallen cedar lay half in water. His tail started that quiet sweep. At nearly the same moment, a young deer stepped out from the brush 30 yards downstream, lowered its head, and began grazing at the edge of the shallows. No stamping, no snorting. Calm. I felt that layered stillness settle again, but this time I didn't fill it with fear. I set down the pliers and leaned forward, breathing slow. The creek carried leaf fragments past my boots in little spinning arcs. Micah kept placing stones, 1, then 2. then a pause where he looked across the water, as if listening with his whole body. I followed his gaze and saw nothing at first but trunks and grey light braided together, then a shadow separated from shadow. Across the creek, in blue hour just before daylight drained, an enormous dark-furred figure moved into a narrow opening between two firs. Not charging, not looming, simply arriving at the edge of visibility and stopping. Even kneeling, it stood higher than a fence post. Its shoulders were broad enough to make the saplings beside it look like switchgrass. I could make out long arms, dense fur dark brown near black, and a profile turned slightly away from us, giving Micah space while still facing him. My first physical reaction was a hard grip on the tackle box handle. My second was confusion, because nothing about the posture read threat. It was all restraint. I did not call out. I did not stand up and wave my arms like a fool on a highway shoulder. I sat very still and watched the details my old skeptical brain would later ask for. The figure reached to its right, with deliberate precision, picked up a crooked branch about as long as my forearm, and carried it to a patch of mud near the waterline on that far side. It pushed the base into the soft bank, adjusted the angle, then pressed mud around it with two gentle pats until the branch stood upright like a marker. It stepped back half a pace, checked it, and left it there. The movement had the same care I used setting a torque wrench to spec when over-tightening would crack the housing. Boone gave a single, low huff, not warning, more acknowledgement, and lay back down with his head up. The deer downstream kept grazing. Micah stopped arranging stones, lifted his face, and made a soft, humming note I hadn't heard in months, higher this time, almost bright. He reached into his pouch, found a smooth black stone, and set it at the center of his pattern with both hands. Then he looked toward the far bank and tapped twice on the shale beside him. Tap, tap. The figure held still through that, weight balanced, as if receiving a message it already knew how to read. My mind tried one last hard pivot into denial. Bear with mange, light distortion, someone in a ghillie suit performing an elaborate rural prank for no audience and no payoff. The theories sounded weak even before I finished them. The scale was wrong for a man. The proportions were wrong for any bear posture I had ever seen in hunting season or repair call roadsides. More than that, the behavior was wrong for panic and wrong for bluffing. It kept distance. It worked carefully. It left room around my son the way a good therapist did. I heard my own whisper and almost laughed at myself for saying it. All right then. Thank you. The words came out rough and small, fogging in the cold between my knees. The figure turned its head toward me, and for one clean second, I saw an eye catch the last blue light. Amber brown, steady, not tame, not wild in the way people use that word when they mean unpredictable. Present. That is the word that fits. Present and watchful. Then it shifted backward into the fir shade with a kind of practiced quiet that made no sense for something that size. One step, then another, each placed where moss and needles would muffle contact. No snapped branch. No crashing retreat. It withdrew, like someone leaving a room where a child had finally fallen asleep. We stayed until the light was nearly gone, and the cold started biting through my jacket seams. I walked Micah home with my hand hovering near his shoulder on the slick parts of trail. At the porch he stopped, dug in his pocket, and handed me the black stone he'd used as center marker. I took it, and he closed my fingers around it himself. Boone leaned against both of us, heavy and warm. Behind the house, Alder Creek kept moving through dusk, and the silence between us, for that one evening, felt less like distance and more like a language we had just begun to hear. I stood there a minute longer with Micah's fingers still warm on the back of my hand, the black stone pressed into my palm like a small, steady weight. Then I got us moving before the trail turned slick with full dark. He ate quietly at the table, Feather laid beside his plate as if it needed supper too, and Boone parked himself under Micah's chair with his muzzle on one boot. I kept glancing at the window over the sink, not jumpy, just aware in a new way, like I'd spent a year listening to one station and somebody had tuned the dial half a notch. After Micah fell asleep, I set the black stone next to the envelope with the yarrow note in the top drawer, closed it, opened it again, and moved the stone to my pocket instead. I told myself it was because Micah might want it in the morning. Truth was, I wanted it on me. I stepped out to the porch with a jacket over my t-shirt, cold biting through right away, and watched the yard slope down toward Alder Creek. The creek ran high enough to catch moonlight in broken strips, and the firs across the bend stood dark and patient. I didn't see anything moving there, but the stillness had that same layered feeling from earlier, full rather than empty. I leaned on the rail and let my thoughts run without fighting them. I am a grown man in work boots holding a rock, like it's a letter from someone I never met. I'm trying to stay rational while standing in my own yard, whispering thanks into trees. I am not losing my mind. I know what I saw, and I know what I didn't. No aggression, no bluff charge, no chaos. Just care at a distance. If that sounds strange, fine. Strange and gentle beats, familiar and numb every day of the week. I stayed out until the cold settled into my wrists, then went inside and slept harder than I had in months. By Wednesday afternoon, the sky cleared to a thin, bright blue, and every wet surface threw light back at you. Micah moved fast from truck to trail, canvas pouch hugged to his chest, Boone trotting behind with that old hound sway. At the creek shelf, I skipped the usual pretense with tackle and chores. I took the bucket and set it 10 yards from Micah instead of 20, open in plain sight, hands visible, posture easy. Micah noticed, gave one quick glance at me, then started his rouse. For almost an hour it was just us and water. Chickadees popped in the alder, 2 ravens crossed high over the ridge, and Boone snored with his chin on his paws. Then the bird chatter thinned and settled. Not silence this time, more like the woods lowering their voices. Boone lifted his head, tail swept once, and he stood to face the far bank. The figure stepped out where the fir shade broke into a strip of late light. Full height this time, then down to one knee in one smooth motion so it wouldn't tower over the waterline. Even at that distance, the scale was hard to process. Broad chest, long forearms, dark fur catching copper highlights where sun slid through branches. It stayed there, weight balanced, looking first at Micah's stones, then at me. I didn't look away. I also didn't do anything dramatic because there wasn't any drama in the moment to match. I put both hands on my knees so it could see them, took one slow breath, and nodded once. The figure held still for 2 heartbeats, then dipped its head in a small, deliberate return. Not human, not performative, but unmistakably reciprocal. The crux of it hit me right there. I had assumed I was the observer, the one deciding whether something else was safe, and all along I was being observed by something making the same decision about me. Micah made his soft humming note and set 3 pale stones in a short line. Across the creek, the figure reached down, selected 3 drift-smoothed pieces from its bank, and laid them in a matching line with the same spacing. Boone sat down between us and gave the slowest tail thump I'd ever seen, like a judge approving paperwork. I laughed under my breath before I could stop it. "Well," I whispered, I've officially been outmatched in nonverbal communication. If anyone had seen me, they would have watched a diesel mechanic nodding solemnly at a giant furred silhouette, while our old dog presided like a retired sheriff. I had said "excuse me" to trees a few days earlier. Now, I was in what amounted to a polite, silent exchange across running water. It should have felt absurd. It felt clean. The figure stayed for maybe 15 minutes, never closing distance, never fidgeting, occasionally glancing to me as if checking that we were all still settled. I found myself talking in a low, even voice, not to make it understand words, maybe just to steady my own body. "He likes patterns," I said, nodding toward Micah. "Always has. Helps him make sense of things." The figure tilted its head slightly, then looked back to Micah's hands. When Micah finished his row, he tapped twice on shale. Across the creek, one broad hand pressed lightly to the ground twice in answer. It withdrew before full dusk, backing into fir shade with that same careful placement of each step, and the regular forest sounds returned in layers after it was gone. We walked home with Boone weaving between us, and my skepticism, which had been armor for so long, didn't crack all at once so much as loosen at the straps. Thursday morning, I caught Nora Bell between sessions because I needed language for what I was seeing, even if I couldn't give her the whole picture yet. She stood in the hallway with her clipboard and that patient expression of hers. "I've been sitting with him at the creek, like you said," I told her. "Matching pace, not pushing. There's more engagement. He's initiating patterns, shared attention lasting longer." Her face warmed. "That's significant. You're building relational safety. Without speech." "Speech is one channel, not the channel," she said. "For some kids, shared rhythm and predictable presence are the doorway. Keep doing what's repeatable. Let him lead the format." I nodded. "So if the format looks unusual, but he's calmer, more connected, I don't need to force it into normal." "Normal is overrated," she said, and gave me a small smile. "Connected is the goal." That line sat with me all day at the shop while I changed filters and chased an electrical short through a hay truck harness. Connected is the goal. By late afternoon, a wind came down the draw, sharp and wet, and clouds stacked over the ridge with that bruised color that means steady rain by night. The rain started just after supper and stayed with conviction, drumming roof metal, filling gutters, pushing Alder Creek loud enough to hear from the hallway. I checked the porch tarp twice, then once more before bed because worry likes chores. By dawn, the wind had shifted and blown half the yard litter down toward the creek. Alder limbs, bark strips, dead reed clumps, a tangled length of old rusted fence wire I must have missed in spring cleanup. The bank would be a mess. I almost kept Micah home from school and cleared it first, but routine mattered more than my urge to control every variable. 3 days passed before we got our next clear afternoon. The ground was soft, the trail pocked with fresh mud, and I carried a rake over my shoulder expecting an hour of cleanup before Micah could settle. He hurried ahead, then stopped short at the bottom and looked back at me with his whole face lit in that quiet way he had when something was exactly right. The shale shelf was clean, not magically clean, worked clean. Drift and branch litter had been pulled into 2 tidy piles above high water line. The rusted wire was gone from the path and coiled far upslope where no boot or paw would catch it. Along the edge where Micah usually sat, a low border of flat stones had been set to hold back sliding mud, each one fitted against the next with careful pressure. No smashed moss, no gouged roots. Beside my usual bucket spot sat a neat stack of dry alder splits under a slanted sheet of cedar bark, sheltered from the last of the drizzle. I knelt and touched the wood, dry to the core. Micah crouched at his place, ran his hand along the new stone border, and let out that soft, humming note. steady and bright. Boone made a slow circuit of the area, sniffed everything once, then lay down exactly where he always did, entirely at ease. I stood there with the rake hanging useless in my hand and felt my throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Across the creek, in the shadow of the firs, the figure was already there, seated back on its heels, watching us take it in. No display, no demand for recognition, no movement that said, "Look what I did." Just presence. I set the rake down and stepped to the water's edge where footing was solid. "I see it," I said quietly. "Thank you." The figure lowered its head once. Then, with the same deliberate care I'd come to recognize, it reached to the ground beside it and lifted something small and pale. One smooth quartz pebble threaded through a loop of twined grass. It set that loop on a flat rock near the far bank, right at Micah's eyeline, and eased its hand away. A gift in plain view. Conversation continued. Micah watched, then looked at me. He held up the black stone from my pocket. He'd taken it back that morning without ceremony, and waited. I nodded. He placed the black stone at the center of his first row, then chose two lighter stones and built outward from it, careful and calm. I sat on the bucket and started splitting one of the dry alder pieces with my hatchet into kindling curls, not because I had to, but because the rhythm fit the moment. Every few minutes I looked up. The figure remained where it was, watchful and unhurried, as if making sure the space held for all three of us. By the time dusk climbed out of the creek bed, I understood the kindness for what it was. Not rescue, not spectacle, not a trick to convince me of anything. Practical care offered without crowding, aimed straight at the two beings I loved most in the world, and by extension, at me. The silence between us had always felt like a locked gate I kept rattling in frustration. That afternoon, it felt more like a footbridge somebody had repaired while we slept, plank by plank, then stepped back so we could cross it ourselves. When we finally stood to leave, Micah paused at the edge of the trail and placed one small striped stone on the top of the dry wood stack, deliberate as a signature. Across the creek, the figure rose to full height, enormous against the dark fir trunks, then took one step back into shadow and was gone, without a sound. Boone leaned into my leg. Micah slipped his hand into mine for the climb up the slick turn by the cedar stump, and he did not let go until we reached the porch light. Inside the mudroom, Micah kept his hand in mine while I hung our jackets and nudged the door shut with my heel. Boone shook creek damp onto the floorboards, then leaned against Micah's leg like he was bracing a fence post. Micah didn't pull away. He was warm from the climb, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes bright and steady in that way that always told me his body was regulated and his mind was open. He let go of me only to take off his boots, lined them heel to heel by the bench, then reached into his canvas pouch and set the black stone on the bench between us before touching my wrist twice. Slow down. Notice. I nodded. At supper he ate more than usual. Cornbread first, then chili, then half a pear. He kept glancing toward the window over the sink where dusk pressed soft against the glass. I kept expecting the usual evening drop, that tired inward turn where he left the room, even when he was still seated in it. It didn't come. After dishes, he went to the porch door, waited until I joined him, and pointed down toward the creek with one finger, then to his chest, then to me. Not words, clear enough. "Tomorrow," I said. "We'll go early." He held my eyes for a full second, then pressed the black stone into my shirt pocket himself, careful as a man putting away a keepsake watch. He went to bed without protest. Boone settled by his door. I stood in the hallway, hand on the pocket where the stone sat, and felt something in me loosening that had been clenched so long it had started to feel like bone. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the yellow lamp on and no radio, listening to Alder Creek running high in the dark. I laid out the envelope with the yarrow floret note, the feather Micah had brought up days earlier, and a legal pad I used for parts orders. I wrote down what had happened at the bank in plain mechanic language, like I was documenting a machine fault I needed to verify later. Date, weather, location, observed behavior, distance, no signs of threat, repeated patterns of intentional placement. Then, I stopped writing because the facts were in front of me and they still weren't the whole thing. I leaned back, rubbed my eyes, and let my mind say what I had kept boxed up for months. I am tired of performing competence in every room. I am tired of treating grief like a problem set with missing numbers. I am tired of the fear that my son is drifting someplace I can't reach, and that my job is to smile and pretend I'm not drowning 3 feet away from him. I sat there and let that truth land without correcting it. Then another truth followed right behind it, quieter and harder to argue with. Something out there had been patient with him, and with me, when patience was the one thing I kept running out of. By the next afternoon, low cloud had dropped over the ridge, and the light never moved past grey. I picked Micah up from school, and he climbed into the truck, already clutching his pouch. No detours, no snack at the counter, just boots and jackets and down the path. Boone moved ahead, hips stiff for the first 100 feet, then loose once he found his rhythm. Cold air smelled like wet bark and iron-rich mud. The creek sounded heavier than yesterday, a broad, steady push over stone. I carried that old fear with me all the way down, same one that visited at 3 a.m. and never knocked, that I was losing him to a private country where fathers couldn't go. When we rounded the last alder and the shale shelf came into view, I stopped so abruptly Boone bumped my knee. Micah was already at the edge of the water, crouched with his hands on his thighs, humming under his breath. Several yards to his right, on the same bank, the figure sat back on its haunches, broad as a stump, still as cedar, head slightly bowed so it did not dominate the space. It had positioned itself with care, far enough not to crowd, close enough to be plainly with him. No panic hit me, no urge to run, just a deep, full-body awareness that I was inside a moment I would measure the rest of my life against. I stepped down slowly, hands visible, and took a knee 10 feet from Micah. Boone came beside me and sat. The figure watched us both, then lowered one long arm toward the stones near its knee. It selected 3 and moved with such deliberate precision, it reminded me of watching a surgeon pass instruments. Small stone first, set on the shale between Micah and me. Larger stone second, set a little nearer to Micah. Middle-sized stone last, placed between the two, not touching either, exactly centered. My breath caught so hard it hurt. Nora's therapy room flashed up in me clear as daylight. Laminated cards, soft rug, her voice saying, "Start with sequence, me, you, together. Don't force language, let him place the middle when he's ready." We had practiced it on good days and bad days, with blocks, with cups, with mismatched toy cars. Me, you, together. Most times at home I couldn't get past the first 2 without him withdrawing. I looked at the 3 stones, and then at Micah. He was watching my face, not the ground, waiting. I put my palm on the smallest stone near me. "Me," I whispered, voice shaking. I nodded toward the largest near him. "You." Then I pointed to the centered stone. "Together." Micah reached out, picked up the center stone, and placed it in my hand. He closed my fingers around it, then laid his own hand over my knuckles and kept it there, firm and warm and unmistakably intentional. Something in me gave way all at once. Not dramatic, not loud, just a long-held weight finally finding a place to go. My shoulders folded, my head dropped. Tears came hard and steady, hitting the back of my hand and the stone in my palm. I tried to breathe through it and failed, then tried again and found it. Boone pressed against my side without shifting his gaze from the water. Micah kept his hand where it was. No flinch, no retreat. Holding contact through the whole shaking minute like he had decided the bridge was staying up this time. "I got you," I said, though it came out broken. "I got you, buddy. I'm right here." He answered the way he always answered when words were too narrow. He leaned his forehead to my shoulder and stayed. When I finally lifted my head, the figure was watching me with those amber-brown eyes, calm and steady. No triumph in them, no demand to be understood, only recognition. It had done exactly one thing, and done it at the exact right moment. I gave a small nod through wet eyes, the only thanks I had that matched the size of what had just happened. The figure returned the nod almost too slight to see, then shifted its weight forward and rose. Even standing, it moved as though every inch of space around us mattered. It took one careful step backward, then another, choosing footing that avoided loose shale and shallow splash water where Micah's boots rested. A bent fern brushed its calf and sprang back. It turned sideways through a gap in alder and cedar, not breaking branches, just parting them with the back of one hand, and withdrew into the trees without ceremony, without lingering, without any performance of departure. In 3 breaths it was shape, then shadow, then only forest again. The creek kept moving. A raven called once from upslope. Boone's tail gave a slow sweep across wet leaves and went still. Micah and I stayed where we were. I didn't chase. I didn't stand and stare into the timber trying to force one more glimpse. I knew enough to leave grace where it had been given. We sat with the 3-stone pattern between us, now missing its center because that one was still in my hand. After a while, I noticed the physical traces left in plain view and felt that practical part of my brain settle around them like it settles around torque values and serial numbers. 2 deep prints in fresh mud at the edge of the alders, longer than my boot by half, and wider through the ball. A third, partial where heel pressure had turned on soft clay. The bent fern by the waterline. A triangular arrangement of 3 dark stones placed just beyond Micah's usual rows. Not random scatter, not creek drift. Intentional markers. I studied them long enough to remember details, then chose not to bag anything, not to cast anything, not to turn this into a courtroom exhibit. I said it out loud so I wouldn't backslide later. "We leave it," I murmured. "We remember it right." Micah tapped the back of my hand twice. Agreement. Then he took 1 flat striped stone from his pouch and set it beside the triangular 3, an answer offered in his own grammar. He looked toward the trees where the figure had gone, lifted his hand chest high, palm out, held it there, then lowered it. We walked up the path at dusk, slower than usual because the mud had slicked over roots. Micah held my fingers the whole climb, let go only to step over the cedar stump turn, then found my hand again on the other side. Boone followed close behind, breathing heavy but easy. At the porch, Micah stopped at the rail and looked back once toward the creek. No fear in him, no agitation. Just that settled, grounded focus I had spent 3 years trying to protect. Inside, I wiped mud from his boots while he stood steady against my shoulder. He took the center stone from my palm, looked at it a long time, then handed it back and touched my shirt pocket. "Keep it." I slid it in. After he was asleep, I went to the porch with a coffee mug gone cold in my hands and listened to Alder Creek in the dark. My face still felt tight from crying. My chest felt hollowed out in the best possible way, like a room finally cleared of broken furniture. The silence between us wasn't gone forever. I wasn't naive enough for that. But it wasn't the ruler anymore. We had another way now. Shared rhythm, shared attention, hand over hand on a stone that meant together. Down beyond the yard where the bank bent out of sight, the creek kept moving through night under fir and cloud. And somewhere in that timber, an unasked kindness had already gone back to its own life. I stayed on that porch until the coffee went colder than the rail under my forearms. Then I went inside and opened the top drawer by the stove. I set the envelope with the yarrow floret on the table, then the pale feather, then the little bag I'd used for bolts and washers, then the black center stone from my pocket. Boone watched from his blanket with his head on his paws, one eye open like he was supervising inventory. I turned the stone over in my hand and looked at the crease marks where Micah's fingers had pressed it into me at the creek. For months I had treated every hard thing in our life like a diagnosis to chase or a repair to complete. That night, I wrote one more note on the legal pad under the first set of observations. No further collection. Keep what was given. Leave what was left. Then I dated it, folded the page, and put it with the envelope. Rain came hard before dawn and held through breakfast. By the time Micah and I got down to Alder Creek in the afternoon, the deep prints at the Alder edge had softened into broad hollows, filling with brown water, then blurred into the rest of the bank. The bent fern had straightened halfway. The triangular 3-stone marker remained, but water had polished the edges and sunk one corner. I crouched there while Micah set his pouch down and started a row. I felt the practical part of me wanting one clear cast, one photograph with a ruler, one thing to hand a skeptic across a counter. I let that wanting rise, then pass. I didn't bag mud. I didn't move the triangle. I looked, memorized, and stayed. I sat on the bucket and dropped into that familiar, present tense honesty I used when I needed to stop performing for myself. I am not less of a father because my son's doorway is different from the one I expected. I am not betraying reason by admitting what my own eyes saw 3 feet away in daylight. I am allowed to hold 2 truths. The world runs on ordinary causes, and sometimes mercy arrives without explanation. I had spent a year demanding language on my timeline, measuring Micah against milestones as if love were a worksheet with boxes. That posture had worn me raw. At the creek, with water moving and Boone breathing heavy beside my boot, I could finally feel a different framework settle in. Connection was not a prize at the end of perfect technique. Connection was repeated presence with no hidden demand. Small stone, large stone, middle stone, together. At Thursday therapy, Nora met us in the same cinderblock hallway with the peeling animal mural, and I asked if we could use the rug room for 10 minutes after his session. She nodded and gave me space. Micah sat cross-legged, pulled 3 smooth stones from his pouch, and arranged them in the same sequence before I said anything. He touched the first, then my knee, then placed the middle stone in my palm, and rested his hand over mine. Nora looked at me, and I saw her eyes shine just enough to catch the fluorescent light. She spoke softly so he could stay regulated. That's generalized transfer, Dean. He's carrying the pattern across settings. That is a major relational step. I swallowed and nodded. It happened at the creek first. I don't need details you don't want to give, she said. I do need you to trust what this means. He's initiating shared attention and sustained touch with intent. Keep meeting him there. I can do that, I said. And for once the words didn't feel like a promise I'd break by Tuesday. By the next Tuesday, I drove out to Cal's place for feed like I'd said I would. He met me at the barn in a knit cap and mud up to his shins, tossed a sack into my truck, and gave me that same sideways family look from weeks earlier. This time I didn't dodge it. "You asked if I wanted you to come sit with us," I said. "I didn't call you because what's happening down there is real, and it's private, but it's good." He rested his forearms on the tailgate. "Good how?" Micah reached for me, on purpose. "Held on." My voice caught and settled. "Best afternoon we've had since Lena." Cal nodded slowly. No smirk, no challenge. "Then I don't need the rest unless you want to tell it." I studied him a second. "You ever see anything out in your timber? Anything big that moved like it didn't want to spook stock?" He took his cap off, scratched his forehead, then put it back on. "When I was 19, I found my wood stack restacked after a storm. Thought Dad did it. He swore he hadn't. Year after that, I saw something cross the upper pasture at dawn, too tall for a man and too careful for a bear. I never built a story around it. I just quit laughing at old men." He tapped the feed sack. "That enough reveal for one morning?" "It is," I said. On the way home, I stopped at the co-op with the envelope from my drawer. Marla at the garden counter took the dried floret under a magnifier and turned it between her fingertips. "Common yarrow," she said. "Stem was clipped clean, not snapped by weather." She handed it back in the same bag. "Folks use it in bouquets and poultices. Tough little plant." That was all the analysis I needed. Ordinary species, deliberate cut. I drove home, put the envelope back in the drawer, and wrote one final line under the date. Verified yarrow. No further testing. That afternoon, Micah and I built the shelf on the porch rail together. I cut a cedar board to fit between two posts, sanded splinters down, and oiled it while he sat beside me sorting stones by colour. Boone supervised from the sun patch and offered no useful labour. When the board dried, Micah stood on the step stool and placed the pale feather at the left corner, the twined grass loop with quartz at centre, and two black river stones at the right. He held the third black centre stone out to me. I put it in my shirt pocket instead of the shelf. He nodded like that was the correct placement and tapped my chest once. We kept our evening creek visit, even with the cold deepening. The sky was low and silver, breath visible in front of us, alder leaves mostly down. Micah made his rose. I sat close enough to hear his sleeve brush his jacket when he reached. Boone wandered to the fir shade, sat for a minute, then came back and leaned against my knee. Nothing stepped out that evening. No new gift appeared. The woods sounded like woods, water over stone, a crow far upslope, wind moving high through cedar tops. The absence did not feel like loss. It felt like trust. Before we climbed back to the house, Micah set 3 stones between us on the shale without prompting. Small, large, middle. He put the middle one in my hand and left it there. We sat shoulder to shoulder until the light went thin, not speaking, not needing to. I never filed a report, never called a department, never sent photos to men who make a living denying what they haven't seen. I told Nora only what served Micah's care. I told Cal enough for him to understand why my face looked different. Marty and Eli at the shop noticed I wasn't snapping over small stuff and joked I'd found religion. I told them I'd found sleep and left it there. The envelope stayed in my drawer. The yarrow floret stayed in the bag. The porch shelf filled slowly with returned and received things. Always simple, always clean. Some evenings there was nothing new, and that was fine. What I carried forward was not proof shaped for argument. It was practice shaped for a life. Sit down. Match pace. Offer a hand and wait. Let together be built, not forced. I still fixed engines 6 days a week. By December, I had the credit union roll, the shop arrears, and hospital balance into one structured payment plan, and Cal put his fleet maintenance on a standing monthly schedule with us. The budget was tight, but it was stable and current for the first time since Lena died. Grief still visited, especially in the narrow hour before dawn, but it no longer ran the whole house. At Alder Creek, with Micah's shoulder warm against mine and one black stone steady in my pocket, the silence between us stopped being an enemy and became a space we knew how to cross.